Welcome to the Configure Price Quote podcast. My name is Frank Sohn and I'm the founder of CPQ Consulting. This podcast is 100% focused on Configure Price Quote, also known as CPQ, and will provide you useful insights into this topic. My guest today is Derik Quinn, Managing Director at Spaulding Ridge. Derik is a seasoned revenue transformation expert with deep experience guiding organizations across the entire lead-to-cash journey. He's worked with private equity-backed firms and high-tech leaders to unlock hidden growth by combining data-driven insights with cutting-edge technology. Prior to joining Spaulding Ridge in January 2025, Derik held leadership roles at Huron, Deloitte, and Argano, and he's based in Portland, Oregon. Derik, welcome back to the CPQ podcast.
Great to be here.
Very excited to have you back. And let's start by telling me a little bit more about yourself, what you did before you joined Spaulding Ridge.
Sounds great. So prior to joining Spaulding Ridge, I worked at Argano, where I led their revenue transformation practice. And Argano is, you may or may not know, a lot of folks haven't heard of them. They're about 5 years old. They grew largely through acquisitions. So my previous firm, which was a small boutique quote-to-cash firm called Mind, was acquired by them to really kind of round out their larger strategy around building out quote-to-cash. They kind of made a decision that they were going to pick, call them, 4 or 5 value streams along the entire life cycle of a customer, and they picked quote-to-cash as being one of their primary focus areas. So they acquired my company, Mind, in August of 2021, and that's where I spent a good portion of my time before joining Spaulding Ridge.
Excellent. But you spent also time before with Huron and Deloitte. And what I was wondering, especially since you held leadership positions at these different firms, right? Was there any standout moment or project from those days that fundamentally shaped your approach to consulting?
It's a great question. I'm going to answer it without a real good answer. And that is, it's a collection of projects and experiences. I think, Frank, you've been in the space a long time, probably as long as I have, that there's been a lot of change in the space, kind of going back to my early roots of Siebel and configurators all the way through my journey at Deloitte, where I was focused on BigMachines, and then Apttus was the new technology, and then ultimately Stillbrick. So I think it's a large collection of experiences along the way, but I think when I take a step back and I think of the early days of CPQ, it was really focused on solving a specific problem. For example, SKU proliferation, improving the time to get a quote out the door. There were very specific use cases that CPQ was trying to solve. And I think what's happened, mainly what I've seen in the high-tech space, is this evolution to subscriptions and really subscription billing and kind of rounding out lead to cash as we know it today. I think that was a lot of the big shifts that I've seen over time. And I think the other thing is I realized over time that really ultimately what customers were aiming to do is not necessarily implement software, but really to transform the organization. So if you think about the day in the life of a high-tech software company, it's really to drive a few things. One is obviously efficiencies in that sales motion. And 2 is to drive long-term value for the company, which is a lot of where the amendments and renewal process and things happen. So what I learned is that as quote-to-cash or CPQs evolve, the problems that ultimately customers are looking for partners to solve is really more transformational in nature versus implementation in nature. It's really about driving an outcome versus implementing software.
Excellent. Very interesting. Now, let me ask a question which is related to one of your later experience, I guess, right now with Revenue Cloud Advanced, right? So I understand that you had the first rollout for a large manufacturing client, and I was wondering what was the most surprising insight or challenge from that implementation for you?
I think that's a great question. I think the thing that Frank, kind of having a lot of focus in manufacturing, is that manufacturing is hampered with a lot of complexity around configuration complexity. And I think one of the biggest challenges with that project was just the fact that Salesforce is shifting away from kind of legacy configuration rules, kind of based configuration engines, and moving more towards the future, which is really more of a constraints-based model, which is what they're building into Advanced Configurator. And so one of the biggest challenges of that project was just shifting with Salesforce as we're kind of mid-flight in the project. So shifting away from sort of that traditional rules-based engine to moving into the advanced configuration and the constraints-based engine while we're still sort of implementing the project. And I think, because I remember back, Frank, when you and I talked roughly a year ago, and it was kind of early stages of RLM or RCA as we know it today. And the product has come a long way. I think that parity that you and I were talking about a year ago is definitely there. I would say RCA is definitely feature parity with CPQ as we knew it, but it's still evolving and it's still changing and it's still improving over time. So kind of implementing a solution as things are still changing and evolving over time is probably the biggest challenge.
Excellent. And I'm looking forward to that. I think I have my next update scheduled on that solution sometime in August, and looking forward to see how that looks right now. But let's go back to yourself, right? So you've earned degrees in IT and you have an MBA, right? And I was wondering how that combination influences the way you bridge technology and business in its CPQ transformation.
It's a great question. And I think, Frank, as I think about the answer to that, I think back to kind of basically the crux of I think where you're going there, right? Which is, if I think back to my early, part of my career with CPQ or configurators and then eventually quote to cash, my energy and focus was largely on solving the technical pieces of the solution. So how do you take customers that have a lot of SKUs and a lot of configuration complexity or a lot of pricing complexity, and then how do you technically solve for that problem? And I think where the MBA are transitioning more towards understanding the business side of what customers are looking to do is I think it gives me two things. One is it gives me the ability to sort of understand both sides of the equation. So at the end of the day, we have to understand the requirements. We have to understand what the customer is looking to do. What's the business value? What are the trade-offs we're going to make along the way to get them ultimately what they want? And then on the other side of the coin, we actually have the sort of the brass tacks of how we're going to actually go implement this and turn this on. And I think what I've learned most is that it gives me the ability to sort of pivot and play really the role that I ultimately want to play. And that's sort of keeping us honest on both sides, right? So we've got to solve and we've got to create the best solution for the customer, but we've also got to ask questions like why? Why does the customer need this? Why is the customer looking to do this? What's the business impact if we don't do this? So I think having a business degree and having just the experience over time to kind of have that full management consulting approach to how I solve projects and help customers through their journey gives me the ability to sort of make sure that we're focused on the outcomes versus implementing software. Because at the end of the day, it's the outcome that matters most. That's what got the initiative off the ground in the first place.
Would fully agree. I think it's a very valuable skill combination in that regard, right? No question. Now, before we talk a little bit more about Spaulding Ridge, right? So I would like to understand, what are you doing these days to get you distracted from work? I hope you still have some time beside work.
Yes. So I think I mentioned to you last time that I'm an avid runner. So I'm now approaching 4 years. I've turned my life into a big gamification on the Nike app. So I'm trying to get to 9,400 running miles by next May, which would put me at roughly 4 years and 3 months into this running journey. So you could just do the math, 9,400 miles divided by 4, that's quite a bit of running miles. So I run a lot, and then I also bike. So I'm pretty heavy into mountain biking and pretty heavy into road biking. But like recently, I transitioned away from mountain biking and road biking and then kind of moved more into gravel cycling, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with. It's basically the same idea. It's just you spend more time on gravel roads versus, the single track trails. And then aside from that, I've got 2 girls that are growing up, quickly. One's going to be in high school next year and the other one's going to be in middle school. So heavily focused on a lot of their activities because they're both getting busy with soccer and cheerleading and gymnastics and all this other sort of stuff. So I spend a lot of time there.
Yeah, it still sounds like you don't have too much time to think about it, right? So because with all the activities, it looks like you're going to be pretty busy most of the time.
Yep.
Excellent. Then let's talk about Spaulding Ridge, your new company that you joined since last January, right? So tell me a little bit more about that company and the CPQ consulting services that they offer.
Great. Yeah, for sure. So kind of speaking to my specific area, so Spaulding Ridge is kind of a full services consulting firm. They really focus heavily on the office of the CFO, which is a really great synergy for me. That was one of the motivators to make the shift to Spaulding Ridge, is because a lot of the work that I do, I see it as more it's really the CRO and the CFO. And if you do this really well, those two roles function together in the organization to drive the ultimate outcomes that every one of these organizations want to do. And so they focus very end to end in that entire journey. And so within my world of quote to cash, or what we call revenue excellence, I focus mainly in manufacturing, high tech, and medtech. Those are really sort of the industry focuses. I think medtech and manufacturing have a lot of great synergies. They deal with hard goods and things that are manufactured and built. And then of course high tech is a big focus around subscription and SaaS. So I'd say that's a big focus from an industry perspective. I'd say we range a lot from the mid-size, mid-market type of companies all the way through the enterprise. So think of it as like a GSI, but focusing more on the value, more on the outcomes, and bringing the same breadth and depth without sort of bringing the bloat, if I'm honest. And so we also have a global capability. So ironically, Spaulding Ridge has a true global presence. So we actually have offices in other countries. We've got the nearshore, offshore capability, and physical offices all over the world.
Excellent. So you already answered my question. So I see you remember when we talked the last time concerning industry, customer size, and geography. Then let's talk a little bit more about how many CPQ quote-to-cash revenue management consultants does Spaulding Ridge have at this time?
Yeah, so it's just over 100 resources globally. I think, as you know, Frank, we talked last time, we've probably been very focused on shifting our resources away from traditional packaged Salesforce CPQ and kind of shifting them over to RCA. But I'd say we have roughly 100 resources globally, both onshore and sprinkled across the GDC. We call it the GDC, our Global Delivery Center, and so we have offices there in the Philippines and India. So about 100 resources globally.
And how is the Revenue Cloud Advanced business going for you these days? What would you say after we had the last? We had 1 year in between the last interview, right? So, and I think then it was starting. Now it has gone on. What's your main takeaway from it so far?
Main takeaway I would have from it is I think it's starting to take shape. I think when you and I were talking last year, Frank, I think, to be honest, a lot of customers were sort of trying to figure out how quickly RCA, or Revenue Lifecycle Management, as it was called then, was going to get to parity with CPQ, so they could make a more thoughtful decision as to do they make the move to Revenue Cloud Advanced versus another solution. So that'd be more customers that maybe are on Oracle or another solution contemplating moving to Salesforce. So I'd say that ship is kind of passed, and I think now we have parity. And I think a lot of customers that maybe are on another platform entirely are now confident and convinced that RCA is in a place now where they can actually move and make that shift if they choose. And I think the other sort of scenario is really some of the early adopters of the packaged CPQ solution, the Steelbrick solution. And what I found interesting, Frank, is sort of where customers are in their journey, and kind of where they are is they're all excited about RCA. I think when you talk about multi-cloud, you talk about order deprovisioning and being able to kind of manage that life cycle of an order, post-order, and CPQ all the way down to an ERP system. I think that's where a lot of customers are excited. Quite frankly, where they're all kind of at, those customers that were early adopters of CPQ are really trying to figure out what's the journey look like to make the shift. Because as you know, making that shift is probably more of a phased approach. So then that opens up a whole lot of great conversations with the client about how best they want to do it. Do they pick the easy geo first? Do they pick the most complex line of business first, and then the easier line of businesses follow? How do you handle sort of the complexities of mid-flight? What do you do when you have CPQ and RCA running in parallel? How do you handle all those different business operations and processes? So I think that's where it is. I think customers are excited about it. I think they're all in similar stages of the journey, trying to figure out what's the best approach to make the move.
But you bring up an interesting point, and that's where is the most growth? You think it's mostly new customers? That's what my understanding what my understanding was that new customers who haven't dealt with older Salesforce CPQ product were most excited, most interested, or do you see even from the existing customer base that they want to move over to Salesforce Revenue Cloud Advanced now?
Yeah, it's a great question. I tell you my take, and this, Frank, is coming from the perspective of high tech. Although if you asked me the question for manufacturing, it would be more what you said. I would say it's more moving off of BigMachines or moving off of something else to Salesforce, and then realizing with the advanced configuration and the capabilities of RCA, realizing they can actually do that. But I think for high tech companies, they usually were pretty early adopters of CPQ. A lot of the larger high tech customers I've worked with have CPQ, and oftentimes they have Salesforce, which means they likely have SteelBrick or the older package solution. So I think they are contemplating making the move, and I think for them it's a migration activity of, hey, I've accumulated all this tech debt over the last several years. I've grown through acquisitions. Maybe I'm growing globally, and I'm trying to move to new monetization models. Maybe I want to get into consumption and usage, and I feel hampered by the solution I have today, and I want to migrate to something else. And hey, maybe now's a good time to move to RCA. I think that's a lot of customers in high tech are in that space.
Looking for a fast, reliable way to get up to speed on Configure Price Quote? The CPQ Briefing subscription delivers analyst-grade insight in minutes, no marketing noise, just facts. Right now, you unlock 11 concise briefing documents covering leading CPQ platforms and key add-ons. For more are in final review, and 20-plus additional briefings will roll out by mid-September, so the library keeps growing every week. Each briefing distills capabilities, roadmap signals, and buyer watchouts into a 5-minute read you can act on immediately. Discover how simple CPQ research can be. Visit novicecpq.com/CPQ-briefing-subscription and start exploring today. Clear, practical guidance is just a click away.
But what would you say for Spaulding Ridge? More interest for new customers or more interest in customers moving to the existing customers who want to move to the newer Salesforce solution?
I'm going to say it's probably 50-50. I'd say in manufacturing, it's often, and even in other industries like travel, transportation, and hospitality, some other industries, Frank, where they have a lot of legacy old quoting solutions, I'd say it's more new. And I'd say for manufacturing, it's mostly new versus migration. Where I'd say in high tech, it's probably more migration than new, because they were oftentimes early adopters and already have CPQ.
And let me ask even one more follow-up question, especially concerning the advanced configurator that's now available in the solution, right? So how much interest do you see in that advanced configurator capability?
I actually think it's... as Brian Schweers would say, and I know you've talked to him before, I think it's revolutionary because it's going away from what you and I know, Frank, of the past, of these heavy rules, sort of a sequential, process-driven sort of rules-based engines, to more of an engine that's more focused on, being able to filter out the things more as a reaction to what the customer is actually trying to find in the quoting process, versus a rules-based engine that's going to fire through a series of rules and then ultimately get to what it actually thinks you want. I think this constraints-based approach is really kind of revolutionary. I think the bigger, or maybe the interesting scenario, is because it's so unique and different. I think what I see is a lot of customers still trying to kind of wrap their head around what that means, because it is kind of a very different approach. Right.
I would fully agree. I mean, with the revolutionary, Derik, I mean, there are other solutions which have the constraint-based configurator for a while, right? So, but it is definitely a very different approach, no question. Yeah. Now, also related to that, do you have any proprietary products right now for the quote-to-cash CPQ revenue management process that benefits your customers that you may not sell explicitly, but tell me a little bit about if you have these products, and if you have them, how you use them.
Yeah, great question. So I would say we have more what I call accelerators, or assets and collateral that helps us drive more efficiencies in the projects we deliver. So, accelerators in the sense of, like I described to you earlier, Frank, like the challenge of how do you coexist old and new? Being able to have a process or a methodology or framework for how we can have two things that are sort of competing for a product catalog, competing for a price book, competing for a user's experience. How do you coexist those two things together for a period of time while the customer makes a transition? So that's an example of an accelerator or some artifacts that we have to help customers through that journey. Other things around helping Salesforce sell quote to cash is really accelerators around demo assets and things where we can actually showcase to customers specific features and functionalities. So, for example, there's a lot of excitement around DRO or Dynamic Revenue Orchestration. There's a lot of interest in showing that to customers. So we built that out into a demo asset. So if a customer is interested in seeing that, we can fire that up and take them through that. So it's more accelerators to try to drive helping a customer through that journey, and then accelerators to help us deliver the work more efficiently.
Got it. Excellent. And we already talked about Salesforce as a partner. Do you work with any other CPQ vendors or any other complementary solutions that work with CPQ solutions?
Yeah, great question. We are starting to look into other solutions, call them complementary solutions. For example, there's a lot of buzz, as you know, Frank, around consumption and usage and where does that fit. So we're looking at partners that can kind of help us fill that out, because we know a lot of customers are looking to do that. Also, you're probably aware that Salesforce is going to have a billing, or they have a billing solution in place today, starting to round out some of the features there around revenue recognition. So things that are sort of complementary to the entire quote to cash process. Those are some of the things that we partner with, but we don't really implement other CPQ solutions aside from Salesforce.
Got it. And when you look at the CPQ market now, so until last year from Argano, now from Spaulding Ridge, what would you say? How is the market at this time? How is demand?
Yeah, so I think the demand is high, but I think it's high for a different reason, again, depending on the industry. So it's high for high tech, because high tech companies are trying to leverage AI and other ways to drive more efficiencies in their sales process. And they want to remediate or streamline what they're doing today, and they're looking for ways to do that. And moving to something else like RCA could be the answer. So there's a bit of that drives demand. And I'd say, like in other industries like manufacturing, I see a lot of customers that are looking to sunset legacy quoting engines and are looking for answers of things they can move to. Maybe they've already made an investment in Salesforce, for example, in the front office, and right now they're punching out to some custom configurator that they want to bring closer to the Salesforce platform to round out the process inside of Salesforce. So I think in manufacturing, I see an uptick, but mostly in the sense of sunsetting something legacy. And then in high tech, I see it more of a, do I remediate what I have, or do I move to something else?
Excellent. Now I want to talk about a topic that we talk about, I think, every episode for the last 2.5 years, almost, at least that's how it feels, like artificial intelligence, right? So, and I was just wondering if you have had now any real use case with real customers, and you have actually delivered measurable impact in one of your recent projects, if you can talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, great question. The short answer is we have not had a lot of implementation work yet as of recently around AI. And the reason why I say that is I think Salesforce is there now, starting to really evolve the use cases into the front office. As you know, AI has traditionally been more focused on the back office, so more around service and creating efficiencies more beyond the sales organization. But we are seeing a lot of customers asking us questions around co-piloting, right, Frank, which was probably an early use case that there weren't really great solutions in Salesforce, for example, for a while. And I think now, co-piloting is something that's very achievable. I think, revenue intelligence is something that comes up a lot, right? We get lots of customers asking us questions around how do they get more revenue intelligence embedded into their sales process? So how do you help a sales rep pick the right configuration or the right bundle that's going to get the highest likeliness of driving the right margin and get a more streamlined approval process, for example? Or how do you take the insights over time of discounting scenarios and pricing scenarios and take a lot of different disparate pieces of information together and try to drive some sort of recommendation or advice to the sellers? Or how do you try to push a seller to sell what you want them to sell the way you want them to sell it? Those are sort of the things that customers are starting to ask a lot about. And I think that's where Salesforce Revenue Cloud, let's say Data Cloud and AI or Agentforce, is going to potentially help us solve those use cases. But I'd say for us, it's still a bit early stages for us. We're still hearing a lot of the use cases and still, talking through with clients how we'd actually go solve that for them.
Got it. And what are the top 3 business requirements that you hear about from the customers that you talk to?
I think the most obvious one that I see pretty much consistently every single time is really, how do I get to the SKU that I want quickly? And I think, Frank, you probably know this in manufacturing. Sometimes it could be very complicated. I'm working with a client right now. It's a massive global company, has like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of SKUs, and trying to create efficiencies so those sales reps can find the SKU they want to sell as quickly as humanly possible. It sounds simple, it sounds easy, and there's lots of ways to tackle it. But that's probably one of the number one requirements I see fairly consistently is, how do I get the thing I want my seller to sell as quickly as humanly possible? That's one. I think the second one is really around KPIs and measures. And that's really just, how do I, when you go through the journey with customers at the onset of big transformational projects, you talk a lot around KPIs and measures. There's lots of conversations around, how will we know we were successful? How do we measure our success? And I think what I see a lot more customers asking now is, how will we know that we were successful? I mean, we went through all this rigor to find those KPIs and measures up front to get this thing off the ground, but how will we actually know if we've achieved those KPIs and measures? So I think that what I'm seeing is a lot of focus around defining those things up front and then figuring out, how are we actually going to get the data in the right place with the right tooling to assess those KPIs and measures. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, then I want to ask you, so when, I think it's a very valid point, but then I was also wondering, how do you measure with your own customers if their projects were successful, if they got out of it that what they were trying to get out of it, right?
Yeah, right. So, I'll just pick on some really simple ones. Like if a customer at the onset of the project says it takes me, an average of a day to get a quote out the door, we have to define up front, what does success look like? Is it to get a quote out the door in 15 minutes or less? And so I think that the question is then defining what those measures are up front and then figuring out how are we actually going to measure them. When, as you know, it'd be pretty easy to measure that inside a quoting solution, because you can take a look at when the quote was at a certain stage, when it was initiated, how it's actually moved along the way, and then when did it actually get closed. So that's an example of one that should be easily achievable, but that's just another example. The other thing, like I said, about finding something easy, it's the trick, Frank, is to try to figure out what's a reasonable measure, because that's one that could kind of be ambiguous. I want to find a SKU quickly. Well, what does that really mean? Quickly, how quickly? Is matter of seconds, a matter of minutes? So I think the trick is trying to figure out how to nail down what those KPI measures are. And then the second challenge is to figure out actually how you're going to measure it.
Got it. Now we're coming almost to the end of this episode. Hence, one of my last questions is really, there is a lot of upcoming events concerning Salesforce where you or your team may be. That's if it's Dreamforce or one of the Dream-In events. Tell me a little bit more about that, and how can customers contact you if they want to meet you there?
Great. Yeah. So I think the next big one for us is going to be Dreamforce. We have been pretty focused doing a lot of the regional events for Salesforce this year, but Dreamforce would be the next big one for us. I think this year we plan to put a lot of focus and energy around. We have a project go live that's going to be going into production for RCA in the next few weeks. So we have a lot of things to talk about. And I think Dreamforce is going to be a big focus of us this year, of sort of really launching Spaulding Ridge and launching our success and momentum around RCA.
And what would you say? What's the best way for folks who want to meet you there to get in touch with you at the event?
Yeah, so we'll have, obviously, Spaulding Ridge will put a lot of stuff out on LinkedIn as we get closer to the event. I think we're going to do a series of marketing and promotions to kind of push Spaulding Ridge and our agenda around Dreamforce leading up to the event. And then if folks want to reach out to me personally, I have my email, dquinn@spauldingridge.com. You can always reach out to me directly, and I'd love to have a conversation.
Perfect. And since you already answered my last question, I have no more questions. Derik, thank you very much for making time for the CPQ podcast today.
Sounds great. Thanks, Frank.
I'd like to thank everyone for listening and hope you learned something interesting today. If you like the podcast, please go ahead and rate it on iTunes or share it with your friends and colleagues. In the meantime, you can find us online at www.novocpq.com. So long, everyone.